So this question is about REACH, which is the registration, evaluation, production and use of chemical substances. So this is the regulation, the EU regulation that governs this. It addresses the production and use of chemical substances. 849 pages of REACH, took 7 years to pass. It's been described as the most complex legislation in the Union's history and apparently the most important in 20 years. As the UK leaves the EU, it seems we'll no longer be able to necessarily comply with REACH. So the question is, how is the UK preparing to fill the major gap in skills regulations and legislation if there are no pre-agreed standards for chemicals entering the UK? Are we forced to accept lower standards for our food and products in the future? So I think this goes to this whole question about regulations. Who'd like to pick up on this question about REACH, which is all the regulations that cover chemicals, which is another specific industry where there are obviously big concerns.
So I thought REACH was over 1,000 pages actually, but it was a small font.
According to Satu, only 184, only 849.
I mean, I refer you to Stefan's earlier answer, which is too soon to say what happens to things like that because we haven't started those negotiations yet. But one of the interesting insights into this country that you get from REACH is when REACH was passed, and REACH is a nightmare, okay, as a regulation, it is just unclear, unwieldy. The industry in this country had an absolute fit when it was passed. But you talk to the pharma industry now, they are begging to keep REACH because actually given a choice between a bad EU regulation and not having regulations that are approved the other side of the channel as well, they will all go for the latter. So there's tremendous private sector pressure from big chemicals. Well, because if
bring in the stuff they
if we're operating to different standards, very basic supply chains cease to work because we just can't get the stuff in or send the stuff out. We need to have standards that are mutually approved, and a lot of these companies have very, very integrated supply chains across the channel. So that's the question: is we might not like the regulation, but we want to be on the same wavelength as the Europeans because so much of the trade is there.
Matt?
Yeah, no, so I've worked with companies, right, who in the chemicals, it's amazing. So REACH, you know, if you haven't heard of it before, that's probably a good sign. You know, you have the social life, which is good. You know, Anand brings up this.
This is my social life.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, Anand and I have stopped receiving social invitations because we cannot talk about other things than REACH and so forth. So, so it's a bit of a problem we have.
It's
right?
true.
But I think so. I work with a lot of companies who are affected by REACH. REACH is not only chemicals or pharmaceuticals. You know, it's aerospace, it's cars. I mean, it touches on a huge number of sectors. And I agree with what Anand is saying here, right? This is a classic example of, it depends a bit on the size of the company, I would argue. Yeah. Some smaller companies that perhaps aren't as integrated in European supply chain or aren't as dependent on the EU market might see an advantage here in getting rid of what is a quite burdensome piece of regulation. But fundamentally, very practically, you know, there are, I don't know, is there 8,000 REACH registration in the UK or something like that? I mean, a huge number. And what happens on Brexit day one if those REACH registrations are no longer valid?
Though it's worth saying that if that small company discovers it's part of a bigger supply chain than it realised.
Yeah, no, and I deal with that. And the trickle-down effect is enormous. Just one wider point, and we're looking at companies who are now thinking about, do they have to transfer the REACH registrations to the 27 entity, etc. It's a very complex thing. But one bigger level, one sort of high level point on the REACH specifically. REACH, because it is such a complex piece and quite burdensome piece of regulation, which would have even been more burdensome, by the way, had not the UK been in the EU to move it from one DG to another. So if it Verheugen, I think, who was in charge of it and sort of made it slightly less cumbersome. That's a point around being why you shouldn't be subject to regulation about representation. Slightly different point, but nonetheless one is valued. But it's an interesting point about REACH with respect to how the UK sees itself facing with respect to the EU and with respect to the rest of the world. Because if you're a chemicals company now, you basically have to choose between, I'm simplifying, complying with REACH and deal with the EU, or not complying with REACH and deal with the rest of the world. You cannot be REACH compliant and compete with China. It's impossible.
My biggest
concern about REACH, which comes in force this year, May 2018, is that the UK, like the idea, of having this this standard, but we don't want to pay for it. So obviously, once we are post-Brexit, do we compromise on our safety standards? Because most people don't understand that REACH will impact on medicines as well as chemicals, shampoo, in every part of our lives. So I think
No,
the UK doesn't really want to.
No, but I don't. I guess what I was getting at there in a slightly long-winded way is that I think the UK practically it will be a negotiation point around mutual recognition, but in terms of the standards, I don't think Britain has any choice at this point in time than to be REACH compliant, continue to be REACH compliant.
That's exactly
I just don't because I don't think there's any. The cost is a large chunk of the cost for business. It's a sunk cost. You know, REACH has been implemented. I mean, it's been upgraded, right? But it's a few years back, so it has a lot of that is now sunk cost. And again, I don't think there's a mandate for lowering standards.
I'm going to come to Stefaan, but Christophe, when Canada was negotiating, the chemicals are no part of the CETA agreement, is that right?
Well, goods are part of the CETA agreement, and so one part of the CETA agreement is a chapter on regulatory cooperation. But there again, that's a big difference between a free trade agreement and being a part of the single market, because we obviously have not been participating in creating these joint rules that apply across the single market, and so that becomes a non-tariff barrier to trade between Canada and the EU is the cost of selling goods into Europe that comply with these complex sets of regulations. And over time there may be efforts at, and there are mechanisms put in place in the agreement to achieve mutual recognition, but you're still going to have a border. You're still going to have to show before you arrive in the EU that you are compliant with EU regulations in order to sell your product. And so that's the issue with a border like Ireland, for example. If you are not going to be in compliance with the regulatory environment of the EU, then there are going to have to be verifications. There are going to have to be checks, necessarily.
And Stefaan, is this potentially a really big problem that at Brexit, pharmaceutical companies are going to find themselves maybe unable to sell their products, maybe unable to get some of the materials that they need?
It can be, and that's part of what companies do prepare for. So that's one point to make. The other point I want to make, compared to what was said, is what can be burdensome for industry can be beneficial for public health. Mm-hmm. And so I understand that businesses complain about REACH, but there is also a public health aspect. You talk about shampoo, you talk about pesticides, you talk about biocides. And in terms of not being invited, the UK will no longer be invited to the European Chemicals Agency, which adds to the 850 pages you referred to, because they deal with requests for authorizations all the time, the 8,000 that Matt referred to earlier.
Can I just come back on something that Christophe said that I think is absolutely fundamental and we need to pay attention to? There's a lot of nonsense being spoken at the moment that if we are in some customs union, we solve the Northern Ireland border issue. We absolutely do not, because if our
We've got a big Northern Ireland question coming up. I'm just trying to finish this.
Just getting
point
going
about
then.
but just on the point that you're making, many of the Brexiteers are saying, well, of course we'd sign up to the European Chemicals Agency. Of course we'd be a part of that. I mean, but you're saying that that is not a given.
If you leave the single market, that's not a given, no? Absolutely.
What's ironic about this, though, is my impression as a Canadian living in the UK is that this is a jurisdiction that cares very much about high standards. It's very, obsessed about the quality of its food, the quality of what goes into the environment. And, bravo, it's a good thing. But, it's just ironic that, we need to free ourselves from this regulatory environment, which, by the way, the UK spent the last 45 years helping build.